Hello and welcome to the Holy Rivals Show. I'm your co-host, Nathan Bomber Brown, and with me is my absolute partner and also co-host, the Wild Ute. How you doing today, Ute?
I'm doing great. How you doing today, Bomber? What's going
I'm
on,
doing,
Jeff? Welcome in.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
you bet. I was just going to say, go ahead and introduce him if you'd like.
For sure. Yeah. So Jeff's in the house today. We're going to talk about a really important issue that's been pressing on everybody's mind, and that's the ACC, the grant of rights. Understanding what's going on legally with the grant of rights is something that kind of goes over my head oftentimes. And Jeff's in here to help us make some sense of what's going on with the grant of rights. He's done a lot of research, and I'm going to let him tell you a little bit about that. But first off, Jeff, introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, thanks, guys. I'm excited to be here. I'm a BYU grad, so the Holy War is close to my heart. After school out at the University of Michigan, so I'm a big college football fan, and excited to dig into this stuff today.
Well, perfect. Yeah. So let's get into it, Bomber. Let's talk about the ACC situation real quick, just to give everybody a heads up, really why this matters. So, what's going on with the ACC right now, Bomber?
So let's just set the stage really quick. We
Yeah.
got multiple schools that voted against adding SMU, Cal, and Stanford. The reason they did that, and we've talked about it many times on our other shows, is because they don't want to be associated with schools coming in that might tie them down, lower their value, and they'd like to be in the big pool with the big boys. And so to do that, they want to join the SEC or the Big Ten. We're talking about North Carolina. We're talking about Miami. We're talking about Florida State. You could say Virginia's in there. Clemson certainly is in there. And because of that, you've got this real unsettledness still. After all the realignment over the summer, everybody was hoping it would settle down. And if anything, it's gotten even spookier. So now what we're trying to do and help you, the viewers of our Holy Rivals channel, is to break down actually what are the facts about the ACC GOR. Why is it important? What is it associated with? And how does that relate to what is really the big bugaboo out there? And that's the ESPN contract that nobody, except for maybe the FBI and the President of the United States, has ever seen. So that's kind of what we're here for. Jeff's smarter than both of us. And so we're hoping that he can help us sort of set the stage and catch us up to where we're at.
Yeah, and before we get into the legal aspect, I think it's worth noting that we know for a fact that there's two aspects financially to leaving the ACC for any school, and that's first the ACC's exit fee. There's an approximation of the exit fee being around $120 million per school that wanted to leave. So that's 120 automatically out the door. But perhaps the most expensive thing, and likely the most expensive thing, is actually the grant of rights and getting out of the grant of rights, which is a separate financial puzzle that we're trying to solve here. So, Jeff, why don't you give us a little heads up on what's going on with this grant of
Yeah,
rights?
thanks, guys. Yeah, so as I think about it, there are basically three documents that are key in understanding the ability of a Clemson or a Florida State to exit the ACC. The first of those documents is the formation documents of the ACC conference, and there's a constitution and there are bylaws. So that's the first document. The second document is the ACC grant of rights, which I'll come back to in just a moment. And then the third document would be the ESPN contract that the ACC entered into here a few years ago. So let's walk through these quickly one by one. So initially on the bylaws and constitution, Phil, as you pointed out, there is an exit fee that's contemplated in that document. So the ACC constitution itself, which is publicly available, presumably somebody was able to get it through a Freedom of Information request, and Bomber's got it up right now. And the Constitution addresses withdrawal explicitly and says if a conference or if a team withdraws from the school withdraws from the conference, they have to pay in the form of an exit fee three times three times what it costs the ACC to operate the conference in a given year. And the estimate that we see in the news media is about 120 million. So that's the first cost they would be
so
faced
that'd be like
with.
40 million a year, again, cost.
Presumably, yeah.
Conference.
I think is, yeah. So you're looking at 120 million under the Constitution. And then, but that has nothing to do with the grant of rights. So then you separately have to look at the grant of rights. Now, the grant of rights So the ACC entered into a grant of rights in 2013, and that document was obtained again through a Freedom of Information request, through a FOIA request. And we have a copy of it. Bomber's got it up here on the screen. This document was, the term of this document in 2013 went through 2027. It has since been extended through 2036. Now, the assumption is that when it was extended, that the term was simply lengthened from 2027 to 2036. But it's possible that as part of that extension, they amended other provisions or other terms in the grant of rights. And we don't have a copy of the current one. I'm not aware that it's been made publicly available. So we're stuck with the older version, but in all likelihood, it would be very similar or the same as the current version, with the caveat the current version just has the extended term on it. So an understanding of the grant, the grant of rights, what it would take to get out, this is really the place to start. And it's an interesting agreement. I mean, as a lawyer, I would have expected a document of this level of importance, that it might be, I don't know, 50, 80 pages long with every possible scenario addressed in detail. And that is just not the case. I mean, this thing is 3.5 pages long. It's very short. It's very concise. The types of things you would expect to see that are not included in here, I would expect that it would say, hey, if you want to bring a lawsuit, what state do you bring it in? What state's laws will control the interpretation of the contract? If you violate the contract, what are the damages? What do you have to pay if you try to get out of it? None of that is addressed in here. So that leaves a lot of sort of speculation and gray area in trying to understand how to get out. The other piece, though, to keep in mind is that interpreting this contract really requires an understanding of the ESPN contract, which we don't have. And so, we're somewhat limited in our ability to understand it. As I think about it, if you're trying to get out of this grant of rights, you're trying to somehow exit the conference, there's at least sort of 3 possible routes, right? The first route would be to say, hey, yeah, we admit, we agree, we're bound by the grant of rights, but we want to leave anyway. So let's negotiate an exit. So you go to the conference and you say, yeah, we're going to leave. Let's come up with a dollar amount that we'll pay you, and you agree to let us go. The interesting thing, though, if you're trying to negotiate an exit, is that the grant of rights can only be amended by unanimous approval. So in other words, in theory, if you have one school that's a holdout that says, hey, we're not going to agree to anything, we're going to hold you to the grant of rights, one single school could in theory hold it up. Now, in practice, would that happen? Maybe not. In practice, the conference would probably go get, legal representation. The lawyer would come and tell the conference, here's our recommendation. And the conference would probably vote in unanimity to do whatever their legal counsel said. But on the other hand, you could imagine a scenario where the breaking of the grant of rights is significantly worse for, say, Wake Forest or Boston College than it is for other schools. Schools who, the writing's on the wall, the ACC's collapsing, and they're confident they're going to get picked up, if not by the Big Ten or SEC, at least by the Big 12. Those schools might say, what the heck? Let's just drown this thing now and move on with our lives. But if you're Boston College, Wake Forest, or these schools that are worried that they're going to get the Oregon State, Washington State treatment, they might say, hey, we are not going to sign this, period. All right.
And
So
that could stop the whole thing, right? So
one school could put an end to a negotiated exit. So let's say
2 schools or 3 schools could really add even more pressure on that too, right?
Yep. So if you have some schools that say, we're just not going to agree to a negotiated exit, well, then a Clemson or Florida State, their option would be, okay, we're going to go to court, and and they have a couple options. So the first option would be, all right, we're going to argue that the grant of rights is unenforceable. Now, there is a fascinating 2017 law review article published in the Harvard Journal of Sports and Entertainment Law. And this article is titled Irrevocable but Unenforceable Collegiate Athletic Conferences Grant of Rights. So the author of this article, Mark Wilhelm, he analyzes the grant of rights, including the ACCs, the Big 12, and a couple other conferences. Mark, the author here, Mr. Wilhelm, he's the one who went out and requested a copy of the grant of rights that we now have. My understanding is he was able to get it through a FOIA request. He's the person who tracked it down. And he analyzes in his article here, whether there is any good legal arguments that the grant of rights is not enforceable. And he comes up with what I would characterize as some creative arguments. I'm not sure that they would win the day in a court of law, but I think they're colorable arguments, and they involve issues, kind of esoteric legal issues related to what's called consideration. If you make a contract, in order for a contract to be enforceable, typically each party has to be providing a benefit to the other party. And so he has some, again, these kind of creative arguments that maybe it's not enforceable. So you could go to court, make that argument, be high stakes litigation. Maybe you win. I think that more likely than not, you lose. I think that's a hard argument to make. So that's your first option. Yeah. So your first option might be, let's negotiate and exit. That fails. Mm-hmm. Then your first option is, let's go argue that this is unenforceable. All right, let's assume you lose on that argument. Well, now you're in a position where it's enforceable, and so now you're stuck. Arguing about damages. All right, so you say, we agree it's enforceable. We're going to leave the conference anyway, and we are going to try to take our rights, our TV rights, with us. So we're just going to break the contract. Now, this is the part where I think is pretty interesting. Because there's two options. There's two ways it could go in court. So if the conference is trying to hold Clemson's feet to the fire, the conference could go after what's called specific performance. And the idea here is, hey, Clemson, if the conference were to win, then the conference might force Clemson to honor the contract. So Clemson, you leave under the terms of the ACC Constitution and bylaws. Great, you can get out of the conference, but you cannot get out of the grant of rights. So let's say that the SEC picks up Clemson. Clemson goes to the SEC, but ESPN would still own all of those TV rights through the ACC, and the ACC would then own the TV revenue that would otherwise be going to Clemson. So that is one, I think, actual possible outcome here is that a court says, we're gonna enforce the terms of the contract. Now, it's generally is, while it's a possibility, it's generally not what you would expect to happen. More likely, it would be the court says, fine, you can break the contract, but we're going to enforce damages. And now this gets into an interesting question. What are the damages? So if Clemson leaves, goes to the SEC, they break the grant of rights, they take their TV rights with them, but that presumably damages the conference and damages ESPN, and they have to pay some amount under the terms of the grant of rights and the ESPN contract. Here is where it would be super helpful if we had a copy of that ESPN contract so we could see what it says. Because presumably if Clemson or Clemson, Florida State, if these schools leave, it probably triggers a right within the ESPN contract for ESPN to renegotiate the contract. It probably opens up the contract for negotiation. So let's imagine that Clemson and Florida State leave. That triggers a right for ESPN to open back up the negotiations. Right. And they look at it and they say, okay, without Clemson and Florida State, instead of paying the remaining schools $32 million a year, whatever it is exactly, we're only going to pay them $20 million.
Yeah.
Right.
So let's say, to keep the number simple, that drops from 30 million to 20 million. So now you have your 12 remaining schools, and they were getting 30 million a year. Now they're getting 20 million a year. Right. So that is, you do the math on that. That's 10 million per school per year. At 12 schools, it's 120 million per year. There's 13 years left. I mean, you're looking at like 156 million or $1.56 billion dollars.
And that's not even considering like the new ads, like with Cal and like in any of those.
Right. This is where you get these astronomical numbers where people are looking at this saying, man, if the grant of rights is enforced, what are the damages going to be? They could just be enormous. Now, on the flip side, though, the Big 12's recent experience, I think, is interesting because if you take the ACC and you remove Clemson and Florida State, are the remaining teams really worth 10 million less per school than the Big 12 schools? I don't know. I mean, maybe not. So,
say that again. I want to make sure I get that. Say that sentence again.
Yeah. So here the issue is like, how do you calculate the damages? So it could be that the ACC schools, even without Florida State and Clemson, it might be that they are still worth 30 million per school to ESPN, on the theory that right now they're undervalued given how the market has shifted. And so if ESPN opens it up to renegotiate, they may hold the same value that they're currently getting even without Florida State and Clemson.
They could, looking at the PAC situation though, and the PAC's low offers, so. Right, and like in
I agree.
Offers, yeah, right. Like it's probably not going to turn out that way, but in theory it could.
Right. Yeah. So right. I agree with you. It probably isn't, and this just leads to more of the uncertainty on how you value it. But it is fascinating to play through the different scenarios. I mean, if Clemson, so if you look at the ACC, you've got the 14 schools, not counting Notre Dame. How many of those 14? How many of those 14 schools are going to end up in the SEC or Big Ten?
4. Yeah,
5 maybe.
That. Yeah, less than 6.
Yeah. So all right, let's call it 5. So let's call it 4. So that leaves 10 teams left. Then how many of those teams are going to be picked up by the Big 12?
Well, 4. That is where. That's where the stick and the knife come together, because there's this argument that these are erudite schools that don't want to lower themselves to join the potato picker Big 12. You hear that from Pitt. You hear that from Virginia Tech.
Hey, don't rip that conference.
I'm being dead serious. I'm being dead serious. This is a perception when you are in these discussions with people from Pitt and Virginia Tech, and we're better than that. We don't deserve to be relegated to the Big 12. So
it's all a financial question.
Yeah,
though,
but I think they do. I think they do, to answer my own statement. I think they do move to the Big 12 because the remaining value, even with Notre Dame and the ACC, is still not going to be anywhere close to where the Big 12 is eventually going to be, especially with these 4 new Pac-12, maybe even 6 new Pac-12 schools.
So Jeff, I've got a question.
Well, yeah.
So how's this related to like the Texas and Oklahoma exit? Like the rumors out there of the grant of rights were very similar between the Big 12 and the ACC.
Yeah.
How did they get out of the grant of rights?
Yeah. So in that case, as I understand it, there was just a negotiated exit.
Right.
So they just came to an agreement. The conference let them go. But that is a very different situation than here. I mean, in the case of Oklahoma and Texas, you had 1 year left on the grant of rights, right? So they got out 1 year early is all. In addition, you had ESPN who wanted to get them out. ESPN wanted them in the SEC. They wanted, and the value of the SEC's contract was negotiated with the knowledge that Texas and Oklahoma were coming. So the value in that SEC contract reflected Oklahoma and Texas's presence in the SEC conference. So ESPN wanted them out. Texas and Oklahoma themselves clearly wanted out. Brett Yormark and the Big, under his leadership, the Big 12 also wanted to move on. Everybody wanted him out. It was just a question of what the dollar amount was. And I think Texas and Oklahoma, there was conflicting reports on this, but I think that if they had tried to hold their feet to the fire, I think they just would have stayed an additional year. I don't think they were going to pay those massive exit fees to get out one. Said, fine, we'll be here for 1 more year and then we'll leave. And I think folks knew that. And so by negotiating an exit, they got more money than they would have gotten otherwise.
That's
and
right.
Everybody got to kind of wipe the slate and move forward. In contrast here, if Clemson, Florida State, and a couple of these other schools, Virginia, Miami, if they leave the ACC now, this poses a potential, death sentence to some of these other ACC schools in a way that the exit of Oklahoma and Texas just did not. The other interesting thing to me is ESPN in all of this. If you're ESPN, do you want, I would think, why would you want Clemson, Florida State to go to the SEC? You hold the contract for both the SEC and the ACC. So if they go to the SEC, are you now going to pay $80 million a year to broadcast those schools' games, when right now you get their games for $30 million a year.
But the existential threat is the Big Ten. That's the existential threat. Do they want to lose those schools?
And that opens up another can of worms, because if you go from the ACC to the SEC, ESPN's on both sides of is on both sides of that equation. If the Big Ten gets involved, now you got Fox out there, and Fox, the risk to Fox, and I don't know. I think Fox would be awfully weary to get involved, and the lawsuits and the massive amounts of money at play there. So to me, I look at it and I think, man, the Clemson, if I had to, all of these rumors about Clemson saying we're going to make an announcement, we're leaving, my guess is they're going to come out and say, hey, we intend to leave. And then they just want to see what happens. Mm-hmm. If I'm Clemson, you want out, you want to understand the enforceability of the grant of rights. So what I see him doing is like a San Diego State play, where you want to have it both ways. You want to go in there and say, hey, we intend to leave. And and you want to hope that announcement is sufficient, that now you can go to court or start negotiating and figure out what the actual cost to leave is, without committing yourselves to go down that path. What you
is there a strength in numbers to that as well? If UNC, Miami, and Florida State went at the same time,
the strength of numbers thing is interesting. So the Constitution and bylaws does not address dissolution of the conference, but my understanding is
doesn't mention it at all.
Doesn't mention it. But my understanding, I mean, the only thing it says is it addresses the disposition of assets if the conference dissolves, but it doesn't address, how schools might vote to dissolve it. Now, I understand. I believe that the default rule for an organization like this would be majority vote of the members. Right. So in theory, I think if you got 8, that's the number, because Notre Dame counts as a member for these purposes. Right. So you've got to get to 8. If you got to 8, you could dissolve the conference. And maybe that, if they do that, does the exit fee go away? Maybe, right? You might get out of the $120 million by dissolving the conference. Right. But I don't think it would not have any impact on the grant of rights. The grant of rights
I'm a little
be there.
One thing,
the grant of rights or the grant of rights or the media deal.
Both would still be there.
Dissolution. Yeah. So let's say this again, because I think that's what Phil's getting to. You're saying they could dissolution, the conference could cease to exist, and yet the GOR and the media deal would still be enforced.
Well, so it's an interesting question. Okay. Because the grant of rights, the grant of rights it's signed by each of the member institutions plus the conference itself. So I think that there would be an argument that even if you dissolved the conference, the grant of rights continues. Wow. And so if you dissolved the conference, you would get rid of the $120 million payment. Maybe, not entirely clear. Let's assume that you get rid of the exit fee. You still have to deal with the grant of rights. And
so the grant of rights, so is the conference owns the grant of rights right now? Like, and you license essentially that over to ESPN, correct?
Or is it the ESPN owns it? Who owns
I believe the conference owns the grant of rights.
So, I thought ESPN did, so I'm glad you're here. Tell us.
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, actually.
I love this.
I don't know that there's an entity. I mean, the grant is, so what it says is each of the member institutions hereby irrevocably and exclusively grants to the conference.
Right.
So what it says, let's see, irrevocably grants the conference during the term all rights necessary for the conference to perform the contractual obligations of the conference expressly set forth in the ESPN agreement. And then it says, regardless of whether such member institution remains a member of the conference during the entirety of the term. So it does contemplate, by the way, that if a member leaves the conference, that might happen. Yeah. The member is still bound by the grant of rights. Now, if the conference ceases to exist, that situation is just not addressed here. That would be an interesting scenario.
And if ESPN, because through this whole last year and a half, we've been told it's the conference. And then late summer, we started to hear, when Florida State was agitating, we started to hear that the ESPN deal for the grant of rights for each individual media license was actually with ESPN and the school. It was a direct relationship. It was not indirect through the conference only. So that was an argument. I'm not saying it's true. I'm just saying that's what we started to hear at the end of July. Florida State agitates, Clemson sort of chirps a little bit, and then nothing, right? Everybody at Florida State got shut down and nothing happened.
Yeah, so the grant of rights itself says that it is the conference that has entered into the agreement with ESPN.
So it's not, if it's not the schools, if the
school bounds their rights to the conference and the conference sells the rights to ESPN. So
but if the conference doesn't exist, what's there for them to distribute?
So again, it would be fascinating.
I would love this legal argument to come out.
I would love to get the keys to this, this vault where the ESPN contract is held. And I don't know if we touched on this earlier, but the ESPN contract from media reports is under literal lock and key somewhere, which I'm guessing that is because there's probably only one copy of it or two copies of it, and they're both held in a particular place. That way, when you request it via a FOIA request to the schools, they can honestly reply and say, we don't have a copy of it. So it keeps it out of the public domain. That's my guess on what's going on here.
Wow.
So we just don't know. The ESPN contract, I would imagine that does it. I'm sure it would contemplate what happens if individual member institutions leave the conference. It would have to. I'm sure it addresses what happens if the conference ceases to exist. It would be really fascinating. And in the absence of that agreement, it really is tough to know. But in order to get the conference to go away, you'd have to have 8 votes. And there's 15 members prior to the 3 new members. So I guess now there are 18 members.
Which is why 3 of them voted against it. They didn't want to deepen that pool. So now you need what, 11 or 8, not 10 votes, right?
Yeah. So now, you're at 18. Yeah, you need 10 votes. So I don't think they're going to get it because you go down the roster of ACC institutions. I don't think you have 10 that are confident they're going to the SEC or Big 10.
No.
And you're not gonna break it to go to the Big 12.
Which is why everybody was
Big 12 as a fallback.
That's why everybody was upset with North Carolina State for switching its vote. That's the reason.
Yeah.
Because they didn't want to deepen that voting pool and make it harder to it was just another legal out. They were hoping that would be an easy way to unlock the keys to get out of the conference and make it go away.
Yeah.
That's now sort of sorted.
It is interesting because on the flip side, again, I wish we had the ESPN contract because I could imagine the ESPN contract provides for some pro rata payments. And it might be that contract addresses damages as a function of the number of schools. Right. So if you have 3 new schools come in and you have 3 schools exit, does it leave the conference in the same position as it was? In which case, the damages calculation might be pretty minimal in that scenario.
Something just occurred to me, and I don't know if this is maybe it has, and I've missed it in the conversations. And I know you got to go; you're on timer for this first episode. But the question is, when does that become enforceable? Does Florida State, North Carolina, and Miami, and whoever have 6 months, 8 months to do something before those 3 new votes? Is there a possibility before they come in that the conference could cease to exist?
I assume so. So I don't know the answer to when they are formally joining the conference, but it can't be yet because they're currently in the pack. So it can't be before. It's probably next August 1st.
August 1st.
Yeah. So until then, they would have no say in it. And so until then, the vote would require 8 votes. Once they join, it's 10.
Yep. So we all know Notre Dame's the swing, has been the swing all along. Yeah. They're the ones who wanted Stanford in. They're the ones who are pushing everybody around. And schools are just getting tired of it. Just like they were getting tired of USC doing it, just like they were getting tired of Texas doing it. Everybody gets tired of these bully schools. They tell everybody what to do and how to live their lives. And I think this is one of those situations. North Carolina and et al. Are just getting tired of it, and I could see something happening.
Yeah. Okay. Hey, let's have a sidestep here, and then let's wrap this up, guys. Here. So one last question, then let's do a summary of really what we've talked about. Okay. So the question is, you said earlier that a Wake Forest would have the ability to prevent like a Florida State from leaving based on the language of the contract, right? The bylaw contract.
So that is not in the bylaws. That would be in the grant of rights. The grant of rights requires unanimous approval to amend it.
So why can't, in that kind of case, why couldn't a Wake Forest prevent a bunch of the other schools from from folding the conference? If they can prevent one school from leaving, why can't they prevent more schools?
So they could not, just as a pure legal matter, they could not prevent the conference from dissolving. But even if the conference dissolves, it's a separate question. What happens to the grant of rights? Does the grant of rights also go away in that scenario, or are the individual member institutions still bound by it? That's a legal question. But assuming the answer is yes, they're still bound by it, then nobody could get out of the grant of rights as long as there's a single holdout to amending it.
Gotcha. Okay, so sum it up real quick for everybody. Just succinctly, how would a school, an ACC school, say a Clemson, Florida State, a UNC, how would they approach escaping the grant of rights situation?
Yeah, so on the grant of rights front, if I'm them, the first thing I do is talk to the conference, talk to the other member institutions, see if there isn't a way to negotiate a price to get everybody to approve your exit. That's the first thing I would do. The answer is no. Then I would try to do what I think Clemson might be doing, which is announce that you're planning to leave and hope that that gives you enough standing to go to court and determine if the grant of rights is enforceable. And I would argue that it's not enforceable for some contract law reasons. Assuming you lose that argument, then you're stuck with this question of damages. Mm-hmm. And there it's hard to predict. But ultimately, you probably could force your way out, and you'd be left paying the exit fee under the Constitution and bylaws, which has been estimated to be $120 million, and then you'd be left paying damages under the grant of rights, and that amount is very difficult to put your finger on. I'll note that there was a great article published by Dennis Dodd on August 2nd talking about third-party influence and the potential influx of private equity money into the scene.
Right.
And in that article, he cites some of these private equity guys who are estimating that it would take $500 to $750 million to buy out ACC contracts.
So $500 million.
Just so you know, the very first time I heard about the buyout, I actually guessed on my own $500 million, and everybody laughed at me.
Yeah,
well, and you're right on your nails, Bomber.
And I think that's a reasonable estimate. I think that's a reasonable estimate. You're looking at $120 million exit fee, $500 or $600 million additional money to get out of the grant of rights. You're looking at $600-700 million total. That might do it.
But that money, where would that money go? Okay, so say that you shell out all those damages, $500 million in damages. Who gets the money? Is it ESPN to compensate for the loss of you?
Again, in the absence of that contract, it's hard to know. Presumably, some would go to the member institutions to make them whole, but it could be that those schools are going to be made whole, and ESPN's going to be made whole. So some of it's going to go to those ongoing, those continuing schools, and some of it's going to go to ESPN.
Amazing
it's a lot of
stuff.
money.
It's amazing stuff. Thanks, Jeff, for jumping on. This is part one. We'd love to have you back talking about this again.
Yeah, I'd love to do it. It's been a lot of fun.
Legal strategies. This is real stuff, real talk. And Bomber, any last words?
Yeah, the next time we see you, Bob Thompson's going to be sitting on your left or right. I guarantee you he's going to see this video. I'm going to send it to him, and I'm going to say, we want you here. Because this is the type of stuff he can cue us in to what that conversation's going on in North Carolina behind that lock and key where that other contract is.
Yeah, it'd be fascinating, and he could steer us right in the places we've gone wrong. It'd be great to get a seasoned veteran.
And then we'd break the internet, and everybody would be watching this video. I promise. Hey, Jeff, sorry, go ahead.
If you've liked this video, if it added value to, like the video, subscribe to the channel. Turn on your notifications too, so we can get you good content going forward. And thanks for watching. So, any last words, Jeff?
Yeah, Jeff.
No, thanks again for having me on. I'd love to do it again sometime.
Can't wait. We will set that up. I told Bob he wouldn't be on till later in October, but maybe I can get him sooner. This is a very relevant conversation. It's going to keep going. We would like to have you come back and let's talk Washington State, Oregon State, and the Pac-2.
Oh, I would love to. It hurts. I can hear. So I live in Corvallis.
Right.
I can hear Reeser Stadium from my house at night on a game day. It's painful. I hate to see it.
I grew up in Richland, Washington, and that's that's right next to the Columbia River Basin and the Palouse in Washington State. So I'm there with you. I know exactly how they're feeling in Pullman, and yeah, we would like to have that conversation. So if you want to do a little homework, go and find out whether they're going to be able to cash a check for $320 million.
Yeah, I'll look into it
between themselves. Look into that.
I'll do it.
We'll talk about that next time. Okay.
All right. Thanks, guys.
All right. Thanks a lot, Jeff. All right, everybody. Thanks for being here. Please like the video. We're going to keep doing them. The Holy Rivals, this is what we do. Please let us know how we can help, and we hope to see you in the future. Everybody else, peace out.
Go you.